following the decontamination at the onset of the reopening of the difficult to return zone. So just to remind about the extent of soil decontamination, although I guess that most of you are aware of that. So there were two kinds of zones delineated. The special decontamination zone with all the areas in gray on this map, so including areas far away from Fukushima prefecture. And then, well, actually, this is the intensive contamination survey areas, and then a focus on the red area, which were the special decontamination zones, with different types of measurements implemented, but still covering a wide area of about 9,000 square kilometers in Japan. So this started actually in 2013, and most of it was completed by 2019, except in the so-called difficult to return zone. So the rationale behind that was to limit exposition of the population to a certain radiation dose rate based on international knowledge on that. So basically the special decontamination zone focused on those areas that were evacuated because people were for a long time exposed to dose rates higher than 20 millisievert per year. While in the intensive survey contamination areas, these areas were not decontaminated and exposed to lower, but still significant annual radiation dose rates comprised between 2 and 20 millisievert per year. But still, what is agreed on at the international level, including by ICRP, so the International Commission on Radiological Protection, is that with this decontamination, the target should be to expose to a maximum of an additional 1 millisievert per year, the inhabitants in addition to the natural dose. This is generally what is found in the international conventions, and this was one of the main points taken into account when designing the decontamination measures, which doesn't mean that it was achieved everywhere, but at least that was the objective. So doing that in these two types of areas, we've seen that partly in the field yesterday, in the intensive contamination survey areas, so all the gray areas on the map, so which cover almost 8,000 square kilometers in 40 non-evacuated municipalities. This generated 8 million cubic meters of waste for a cost of 1.4 trillion yen. So that said, it's really focusing on the topsoil, 5 centimeter topsoil layer removed from residential areas and cultivated areas only, not everywhere, only in target areas on this surface. So you see that it's a significant amount of waste, but if you look at what happened in this part of the red area, in the special decontamination zone, so covering a bit more than 1,000 square kilometers, 11 municipalities evacuated after the accident. In these areas, they generated more than 9 million cubic meters of waste because that was higher than in intensive contamination survey areas. So it means that this generated a lot of waste and it costs a significant amount of money. But still, based on the threshold defined as of cesium-137 concentrations of 8,000 becquerels per kilogram. Below this threshold, people were allowed to reuse this material, like for roads or building constructions. And this represents half of the decontamination waste generated until then. But still, you still have the remaining half. And this remaining half, is being stored so in 2 storage sites nearby the nuclear power plant in Futaba and Okuma. So this was the situation, let's say, in 2019, and we tried to sum up what was published at that time with Nakao-san in a review paper published in Soil Journal. But still, since then, many has continued to happen, including in the so-called difficult to return zone. So even in the area nearby. So actually in the areas in green here, limited proportion of the population returns after decontamination, which raises challenges for the residents that returned, including for agriculture, like it was introduced by previous colleagues. And now we focus on this gray area, the difficult to return zone, which is being decontaminated currently, following the same methods as in the other, in the green area, sorry, with the focus on these blue areas, which are the specific reconstruction and revitalization basis, but not exclusively there. Decontamination is also conducted in other residential and cultivated areas in this area. So this is now ongoing and should be planned to be completed next spring, 2023. So the question what we've been monitoring for the last 11 years now is to understand after the fallout on the landscapes, how this moves across the landscape. Of course, via soil erosion and riverine transfers, but also via human actions, including decontamination, which is an important part of the process. And now we are really at this stage where we have forests that remain contaminated, as we've seen this morning. These cropland and residential areas that are being decontaminated or where decontamination has been completed. So the idea is now to understand 11 years after the accident, how this will continue to move and change. And based on what we've heard during the previous presentation made by Valérie, I think at least in France, what I understood is one of the main points that was learned after Fukushima was that contamination was moving significantly with water across the landscape, which was not that clear before. And now, in case an accident takes place in France, usually before, their models only took into account the atmospheric movement of radionuclides, and now they included water movement as well. Because depending on what happens on land use, on the steepness of the landscape, this will control to a large extent the fate of the radioactive substances in the landscapes. So we've been monitoring what was deposited in terms of sediment along the rivers draining the main plume. And the good thing is that when you go back after the typhoons each year or after the spring snowmelt season, and you collect the material at the exact same place during more than 10 years, you can have this type of information about the evolution of the sediment contamination of sediment in these rivers. You have, of course, a lot of dispersion because the radioactive plume is very heterogeneous across space, but still you see a pattern. So you see that typically after 2015, when there was a big typhoon in town, but also when decontamination reached a significant level across many regions, we see a significant drop of these contamination levels. And since then, whatever happens in these catchments, we are well below this green line, which corresponds to a threshold that allows you to reuse the waste for road construction, for instance. So this is part of the good news, but still it remains to be monitored in the future. About forests, because typically it has been said earlier today, forests have not been decontaminated and they store a lot of radionuclides with complex cycles of transfer within forests. So basically what we found in the literature is that there was a progressive transfer of the contamination from the canopy towards the mineral soil, but still you see that there remains part of the contamination in this organic layer. And this part, although it becomes lower and lower, it's significant in terms of transfer, including transfer to plants and to forest products, let's say. So this remains important as well, because when you have heavy events like this picture was taken after Typhoon Ibis, you have also erosion and potential outflow of contaminated material from the forest towards the river systems. It's important about what flows out from the forest, but also, and it was it's somehow a follow-up to Ayashi-san's presentation late this morning, is that it's a problem for the use of all the forest products, including mushrooms. So you see on this map, all the orange municipalities are those municipalities where there are restrictions on the collection and the consumption of mushrooms. And you see that it covers a wide area across Japan. Sansai, that was the discussion this morning, but also wood. Wood for as fuel for warming, as support material for producing shiitake, which was quite common for oak in Fukushima. So it's a problem because all these products will remain contaminated and it will be a problem to use them. Fish is also a problem. And I took these figures from Wada Sensei, who was there early this morning, because of course it's a widely used product in Japan. And although you see that the trends depend, whatever the type of fish you look at, and whether you look at the prefectural data or the TEPCO data, you see that there is a decreasing trend also in space. So the problem is decreasing, but it's still there, including for freshwater fishes. So if you're interested in these challenges, there has been an excellent book published earlier this year by Hashimoto and colleagues on forest in Fukushima. And colleagues from IR also published a book this year about what they learned about regional life in Fukushima. It was published earlier this year, and there is a specific part of the book on the freshwater fish contamination problem and other information like wild boar contamination and so on. So some part of the problem was solved, but not everything, including in forests, in dams, and there will be more presentations about that. And another question we had, and that's the final point I would like to make, is about other regional plagues, because we're talking about cesium a lot. We've also talked about iodine, but there are also, on the contrary to iodine, which has a very short half-life, there are other radioisotopes with a very long half-lives, including plutonium isotopes, or at least most of them. So a couple of years ago, we took some sediment from different rivers draining the main plume, and we looked at their plutonium isotopic signatures, and we looked mainly at the 241 to 239 signatures. 241 is very useful in this case because that's the only plutonium isotope with a short half-life of 14 years, which makes a very good discrimination between plutonium emissions from Fukushima accident in 2011 and plutonium emissions by the nuclear bomb testing the atmosphere in the 60s, because it happened a long time ago. And if you do that, if you look at the theoretical signature of the global fallout due to the atmospheric test of the 60s, you have this signature. In contrast, in Fukushima, fresh fallout, let's say you have this signature. And what we found in this river sediment collected in Fukushima prefecture is that we have a beautiful mix of bomb fallout plutonium and Fukushima plutonium in all the sediment samples. So there has been plutonium being emitted by the accidents, not in huge quantities, but some of it. And one hypothesis was to say that it was borne by microparticles ejected during the hydrogen explosions. The good news is that when we try to do this work again, almost 10 years later, so Aurélie, who's completing her PhD at the French military division of CEA, French Atomic Energy Commission, we looked at sediment collected at the outlet of Ukedo River. And if we do again this work, we have difficulties because we don't detect plutonium-241 anymore. So we have to rely on other isotopes, 240, 239, which is a well-known ratio to discriminate between global fallouts in blue here and Fukushima fallouts in orange and brown here. And what you see is that if you look at the sediment collected in Ukedo River from 2013 to 2019, 2020, we have a very good match with the global fallout plutonium, and we don't see any impact of Fukushima emitted plutonium anymore. And this is also what you see if you look in terms of temporal changes, and whatever happens in terms of typhoon. This is the rainfall that took place from 2013 to 2020. We see a very long-term trend now, a medium-term trend of decreasing plutonium concentrations following very close cesium concentrations. So in terms of persistent radionuclides, at least in this catchment, we don't see any evidence of remaining problems on that field. So during these years, what we've seen is that, of course, after typhoons mainly, we had massive transfers of radionuclides, mainly with sediment in the rivers. Now, cropland has been largely decontaminated, and decontamination is now targeting those croplands and residential lands in the difficult to return zone, where the major concerns, I would say, remain related to what will happen to residual radionuclides in forests, in dam reservoirs, and also the fact that not only these environments remain contaminated, but all the products that you would like to exploit from these areas will remain contaminated as well, including forest products and fish. But among the good news, there's also the fact that typically the Fukushima emitted radionuclides, at least in this example, they are no longer detected, so probably flushed away and diluted somewhere. So with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Olivier. Is there some comment or question?
Where did the plutonium go?
Well, we guess that it has been gone to the ocean, and where it's diluted. You have very strong currents off the coast, and probably it's been diluted.
About the same question, for the plutonium, the session you made 10 years ago, it was also in Hokkaido River, or?
Yeah, at least among the points, there were
both
points in the Hokkaido River, but even in the Nita River, so in Mitate village, so further from the power plant, we found it. So maybe as well, another point is maybe still there, but not so easily mobilizable. So what Aurélie is doing, and currently she's doing a synchrotron experiment, because she isolated tiny particles that are supposed to come from the accident. And now she tried to characterize very precisely these particles. So probably some of these particles are still trapped in the environment nearby there. Okay.
So another point, just a comment from a fan about wood. Maybe that the biggest utilization of wood here is for construction, was for construction. Most time.
No, you're right. It was on the list and I forgot about it. It's wood, yeah, timber for construction, for burning, and then the sheet metal, but maybe it's more anecdotal. Yeah, sure. It's construction. But it's also a problem because you can't use.
There's some question.
I had another question. Hello?
Yeah, please.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes. That was just a simple question, but maybe you said it, but I was interested to know how far you can find plutonium from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant.
In the initial,
but I thought a lot was really like localized around the nuclear power plant and not so far away.
But actually, we found it, and we are not the only ones finding it. There are also colleagues from Tsukuba University who find, if I'm not wrong, they found some kind of also microparticles like the atmospheric dust, but collected also shortly after the accident. But what in terms of what we found, it was like up to 40 kilometers away from the port. So not only in the immediate vicinity. Okay. But the point is that to keep in mind is that you will find plutonium everywhere because of the global fallout. The question is that in this case, you had up to an equivalent amount of that delivered by the global fallout in the soils due to the accident. But it's not changing the global magnitude.
Thank you for your answer. So we are a little bit late, so